Yeah.
My material's not copyrighted. You can use mine any way you want.
This one's for you, Kent.
If you want to get any of my video materials, they're not copyrighted.
Check it out. You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent?
I have a bunch of recent stuff I could reply to. Probably should reply to, but judging from your tweets and DMs and stuff, apparently this 16-year-old speech is what you think is the most time sensitive. Alright, have it your way. I kinda want to finish this thing before it's 2 decades old anyway.
Then they tell the kids about the peppered moth.
Oh, Jesus Christ, Kent, you're just desperate to make this hard for me, aren't you? At least in the last one we got to talk about dinosaurs, but now you want to talk about moths? You know what I hate almost as much as rocks, Kent? Moths. You ever see a moth? What was it doing? Probably flapping around all erratic like some kind of hophead. And then when it finally mustered up enough dignity to give up and land, it was too damn lazy to even fold its wings up properly. Look, Kent, everybody knows my feelings about butterflies, right? Don't even get me started on those hoity-toity fucks. But at least they got some goddamn self-respect, Kent.
Yes, boys and girls, somebody in England went around and counted the moths on the trees. Must have been a government project.
No, I don't think so. Look, I know you're trying to make a joke about wasteful government spending, but, I could make a joke about your taxes, but never mind.
They discovered it's 95% light moths and 5% black.
Well, that's oddly specific. You make it sound like you're talking about a particular study from a particular somebody that got specific numbers, but I don't think you are. The point's more just that there were no known specimens of the black moths that were caught prior to 1848, but the light moths were already common. With an imbalance like that, it doesn't exactly take somebody with a government grant to figure it out, does it?
Well, so the story goes, they burned coal in the factories, the trees turned black, and the moths changed to black moths. Because when they counted them again, they said they found 95% black and 5% light.
I've heard 98% black, but whatever, that's just nitpicking. So, a few extra details here. By the end of the 19th century, about 50 years from the catch of the first live specimen, the tables had turned completely in polluted industrial areas. Not only had the trees there been darkened by the soot, but the light-colored lichen that was on the trees had died. And all the moths that were found in Manchester, where that first specimen was caught in 1848, were black now. But in less populated areas, the light moths remained common. And that was how things were for the next 50 or so years until clean air legislation was passed. And after that, the population of light moths started to recover. And these days, light moths dominate the population again. So those are the basic elements of the story that you'll find anywhere. But I have this weird suspicion that you're about to drag me into the nitty-gritty details of it.
Actually, the whole story is a lie. It never happened.
Which story? The story that the populations changed in the 19th century?
After 40 years of watching, they found 2 moths on the trees. 2 total. Out of 40 years.
Okay, so you don't mean the 19th century part of the story, you mean the 20th century part. Alright, so even though you don't say it, I think I know what you're referring to, and specifically that's a book review from Jerry Coyne from 1998. But I'm going to start just a little bit earlier than that with C.A. Clarke et al.'s 1985 paper, Evolution in Reverse, Clean Air and the Peppered Moth. Considering that this paper's from well over a decade before what I think you're talking about, that title should be a hint to you that you got it backwards which story you think is a lie. You're not talking about the decline of light moths and the rise of dark moths during the You're not talking about the decline of light moths and the rise of dark moths during the Fucking hell, there's so many words that I can't say in this sentence. Okay. You're not talking about the decline of light moths and the rise of dark moths during the Industrial Revolution. No, what you're talking about is the decline of dark moths and the rise of light moths after the air started to get cleaned up about 100 years later. Now, sure, these things are similar and they're equally good demonstrations of natural selection, but come on, let's try to make it clear which one we're talking about at any given time, okay? Anyway, that Clarke paper includes a statement that's long been abused by creationists, which goes, in 25 years, we've only found 2 Betularia. And you know what? I'm not even going to try. If I pronounce stuff wrong, just, the Betularias can sue me, alright? We've only found 2 of this kind of moth on the tree trunks or the walls adjacent to our traps. 1 on an appropriate background and 1 not, and none elsewhere. That's a reference to the researchers' ignorance on where the peppered moths rested during the day in their area. Of course, the fact that they didn't find many moths on tree trunks during the day doesn't mean they had any trouble finding them in general. As shown in the paper, they caught hundreds of moths a year for 26 years in a row, but mostly by attracting them with light and pheromones, so they didn't really know where they were coming from, they just knew they were coming.
So they glued dead moths to the tree to take a picture for your kid's textbook.
They? Who's they? Some random textbook author? I kind of fail to see how that has any relevance to science, let alone to education, considering that peppered moths do in fact rest on trees. I mean, I'm guessing that you don't just mean moths glued to trees, you mean moths glued in positions on tree trunks where they wouldn't normally be found? Or where you think they wouldn't normally be found? But those pictures generally are just meant to illustrate the relative camouflage of different moths on different trees. If a textbook author doesn't have a good picture to use, why shouldn't they just get a moth, stick it on a tree, and take a picture of it? It gets the point across about the camouflage. Anyway, let's get to the point. So, when people noticed how the average color of the moth population had changed, they supposed that birds were eating the moths that were less camouflaged, right? Dark moths on light surfaces, light moths on dark surfaces. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to suppose, but it's still one that requires evidence to be considered a fact. So in the 1950s, a guy called Bernard Kettlewell did some experiments where he released and recaptured moths in polluted and unpolluted woodlands to try to see the differences in how many of each color would be eaten by birds. And just like was expected, the results came out in favor of the bird predation hypothesis. But in 1998, Michael Majerus put out a book called Melanism: Evolution in Action, part of which discussed Kettlewell's experiment, pointing out numerous design flaws, which apparently in Majerus' opinion were the result of, as he put it in an email to Donald Frack, experimental expediency. And he pointed out that better experiments should be done to make sure that the daytime resting places of peppered moths are understood, and that birds are in fact fooled by the moth's camouflage, as they were assumed to be. So after it came out, Jerry Coyne wrote a review of that book in Nature in 1998, where he also criticized Kettlewell's work, although somewhat more strongly than Majerus did, and expressed the opinion that Majerus' work called into question whether there was enough evidence to say that pollution and bird predation were involved in the changes at all, which was an opinion that Majerus strongly opposed. He thought bird predation was the primary factor and that Kettlewell did great work. This review by Jerry Coyne is where you got your number of only 2 moths found on tree trunks in 40 years, but that number's not correct, even according to the book Coyne was reviewing at the time, which cited Majerus personally finding a dozen moths on tree trunks between 1964 and 1996. Of course, there were a lot of biologists who really disagreed with Coyne's conclusions, including Majerus himself, but that's how science works, you gotta bring up the argument if you're gonna settle it. Predictably, though, creationists took to using both Coyne's and Majerus' words as evidence that the peppered moth was not actually evidence of evolution, or at least natural selection, at all. But regardless of the misquotes and misunderstandings, Majerus' work showed that peppered moths do indeed rest on tree trunks, although somewhat less often than they rest in the unexposed locations like up in the branches or in the trunk and branch joints. And I know it's kind of long-winded, but my point here, Kent, is that peppered moths do rest on trees. This was already pointed out in the book that you're quoting the book review of. And by saying that only 2 moths were found on trees in 40 years, not only have you completely missed the point that they're talking about tree trunks, not just trees, and you've completely missed the point of Majerus' book, you've also completely missed the point of how you should be getting your information, and you've chosen to rely on a book review instead of on the actual book being reviewed. Anyway, it's unfortunate for you that your speech here is from 2001 because in 2002, a journalist named Judith Hooper published a book attacking Kettlewell's experiments as shoddy and potentially fraudulent. And I can only imagine how fast you blew your load when that book came out, Kent. And plenty of other creationists did too. Of course, the allegations in the book were picked apart by scientists, but I don't think that was very important to the creationists. And it's also not very important to the fact of whether moths actually do rest exposed on tree trunks, and whether birds really do eat them at different rates based on camouflage, and therefore whether the natural selection of the moths is based on pollution in birds. And it's especially unimportant to whether it's natural selection at all, because it is, even if the selection factor is something else. And so with all that out of the way, let's get to the happy ending of the story. Majerus' final experiment, which was similar to Kettlewell's experiments but with the design flaws fixed, was published posthumously in 2012, and it clearly demonstrated once again that the moths do in fact rest on tree trunks, at a rate of about 35% actually. And it also demonstrated that the light moths, camouflaged on unpolluted trees, were eaten by birds at such significantly lower rates than the dark moths that it would provide a very strong selective factor for natural selection, thus entirely vindicating the bird predation hypothesis and shattering every Christian claim that the population changes could not be considered evidence for natural selection. And Jerry Coyne was finally convinced, and everyone was happy, and they kissed and they made up, which was a little bit weird because Majerus was dead. And Kent Hovind was once again shown to be an idiot groping desperately for any dumb thing to justify his beliefs, and balance was brought to the force. Kind of brings a tear to my eye. Sorry, I feel like I got a little bit ahead of you there. Please continue with your version.
Then he wanted to get a picture of a bird eating a moth. So he put some moths in the refrigerator to calm them down, so they got nearly frozen.
He did? Who's he? You haven't mentioned a he. In the last sentence, you mentioned a they. What are they, gender fluid? They were a they earlier in the day and now they're a he? So, okay, some unnamed gender fluid put moths in a fridge. Whoop-de-doo.
Then he put them on the tree, and they couldn't even hang onto the tree.
Okay, this person put a cold moth on a tree. I don't know why I should care what this random person is doing, but alright, I'm with you.
So he warmed them up on the hood of his car.
Oh, so it had a car. Okay, cool. Well, that rules out anyone from before the 20th century, more or less. You're making this game a Guess Who painfully difficult, though, Kent.
Put them out there on the tree, and the moth is staggering around trying to warm up, and a bird ate one. He got a picture. Wow, proof of evolution. It's a lie. Didn't happen.
Wait, that's the end of the argument? So, your complete argument is some anonymous person of uncertain gender, sometime in the 20th century, probably, warmed up a moth on his car and gave it to a bird. And therefore, what? What's the lie? Birds eating moths is a lie? Well, no, birds do eat moths, whether they're warmed up on car hoods or not. So what else? I mean, what was this guy trying to get a picture for? For the textbooks? A picture of a bird eating a moth in a textbook? I mean, even if you fake a picture of a bird eating a moth, birds still eat moths, so it seems perfectly functional as an illustration in a textbook. What else? Maybe moths on trees are a lie? But that was already shown to be true well before your speech, as I explained earlier, so that's not it. Yeah, I gotta admit I'm a little bit confused here, Kent. I got nothing else. Maybe what you should try doing is, using your big boy words and actually try to explain what you're talking about. See, I have a 2-year-old, and when she comes up to me and spews some goo-goo gaga shit, it's kinda hard for me to figure out what the hell she wants. You're 100 years older than she is. You should have this figured out by now, okay? That's all I'm saying.
Even if it were true, dark moths and light moths were there at the beginning, and dark moths and light moths were there at the end.
Well, if you want to be nitpicky about it, I linked a 2016 paper in the description that places the most likely date of the dark mutation at around 1819, which is only about 30 years before the first dark specimen was caught. So, no, there probably, in fact, were not dark moths around at the beginning. But I know you're not going to believe that, so even if it were true, that would change nothing at all about how the peppered moth is used as a teaching tool, because the reason it's brought up is to demonstrate how natural selection can cause rapid changes in populations when the right pressures are applied. A pretty spectacular instance of it that's been observed in recent human memory. Whether there were or were not dark and light moths around from the beginning of that process is kind of irrelevant. It's still a really good demonstration of that process, so it's perfectly fine for the purpose it's used for.
The ratio of population might have shifted, but the story wasn't true. So?
Yeah, your story about random gender fluid wasn't true. So?
Doesn't prove anything. That's stupid.
What doesn't prove anything? The story? No, it definitely doesn't. Oh, you mean the shift from light to dark and back doesn't prove anything. Well, yeah, that does prove something. Like you said, the population shifted. Natural selection is what it proves. Or at least contributes to the proof for. Natural selection, Kent. Something that you believe in, might I add, Mr. Microevolution. Which makes it really incredibly odd that you spent all this time complaining about it. Okay, you think some guy thing committed fraud some unstated amount of time in the past to convince us of something that you already think is true, and therefore that makes the thing you think is true not true? Not sure what you think this line of reasoning accomplishes, Kent.
That's not evidence for evolution.
Yeah, it most definitely is evidence for evolution by natural selection. Not everything anyone points to has to be evidence for both mutation and natural selection. I mean, at this point it is, because they've done all the experiments on the DNA and stuff, but forget that. Even just as an example of natural selection, it's evidence for evolution by natural selection. Look, I completely agree with you, Kent. If you just went around counting peppered moths, that could not get you to, and therefore mutation provides the material upon which selection acts. But you could reach selection acts, That's what Darwin did. And it took a while, but finally, all these decades later, we've got young Earth creationists like you completely on board with his idea. Now all we gotta do is get you on board with the mutation part and we're good to go. We'll get there. You're clearly more flexible than you think you are. There, we're finally done with the moths, okay? You see what I mean? Moths are boring. Oh my god, this is only like 14 minutes long so far. Well, in theory, I could start the next section of the video, but that's gonna make it awfully long. Or I could, let's see. I know, yeah! I'm gonna resurrect another Old School Logic series inside this Old School Logic series. It's Old School Logic Series-ception. Roll that intro! Count the chromosomes. Yeah, last time I did one of these, Wildwood Claire got all offended that I kept giving this guy a southern accent. I don't think anyone wants to be associated with him, so I'll just give him my wife's accent. Evolution. Did you know that...
What am I saying now?
Did you know that... That's all it really says.
Did you know that?
Did you know that...
No. Did you know?
Yeah, did you know? Did you know that... Yeah?
No, I sound like an Indian.
Did you know that evolution textbooks really... You sound like an Indian, I'm sorry.
I don't sound like an Indian.
Evolution textbooks refuse to teach the number of chromosomes as proof for evolution. Evolution, yeah. Just look at this chart. Evolution insistently teaches that simple life evolves into more complex life. So how can a fern have 434 more chromosomes than a human being? This chart totally disproves evolution. And Mr. Kent Hovind says that he has only found one college-level evolution textbook that even commented on this very embarrassing fact. Probably because that was the only one dumb enough to get it that wrong. The number of chromosomes do not seem to follow the evolutionary pattern. My tongue is getting numb from all these tongue rolls. The number of chromosomes do not seem to follow the evolutionary pattern. Therefore, we feel the information is irrelevant. The ultimate goal of evolution, to be a fern? Yeah, it kind of doesn't make much sense there, does it, buddy? The ultimate in biological complexity? A fern? Yeah, even if that is what evolution meant, that the most complex thing is the ultimate goal of evolution, which is just mind-blowing levels of misunderstanding, but even if it meant that, the ultimate in biological complexity? A fern? I know you don't think that, so why are you trying to pass it off like you do? Maybe if a fern has way more chromosomes than other organisms, but it could be pretty much universally agreed that it's less complex than those other organisms, maybe chromosome count is not what determines complexity. Just throwing that out there, bud. The fact is, the chromosome count doesn't even tell you how complex the genome is, let alone how physically complex the organism itself is. Huh? An amoeba has more chromosomes than man? Wow! This chart proves that kidney beans, redwood trees, and opossums evolved from carrots! The simplest form of life. It has only 2 chromosomes. Aww. Cute. Yeah, buddy, are you really gonna try to walk up to me and tell me a kidney bean is more than twice as complex as a fruit fly? You gonna tell me a starfish is more complex than an alligator? That a sweet potato is twice as complex as a human being? Is that really the argument you're making here? Because this is all contingent on number of chromosomes indicating complexity. If you make an argument I know you don't even buy, why are you trying to sell it to me? The atheist's nightmare, the amoeba. A single-celled organism that's more complex than an entire human being. Can't argue with that. Yeah, that was a great idea. And anyone who hasn't been watching my channel for years is suddenly very confused. But who cares? Bye!
You're a